nothing in my view is all black or white, good or bad. But the internet has some good things about it, but it also has some really pernicious things. And one of which is this centrifugal force of it liquidates gatekeepers, it liquidates authority, people that know more than other people. Like
Yeah.
everybody's thrown back on themselves. Aside from even before you get to, all the misinformation and lies and the algorithms, play on fear and paranoia and all that. Just simply, there's just this information out there. You get 100,000 Google returns, and each individual needs to figure out for themselves what they're going to believe. That really leads, in my view, or at least affords a cultural breakdown. It pulls everything apart and spins it out in a million directions.
So let me introduce you first, and then we'll dive in. This is in
Sure, yeah.
conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Christian Smith. And Christian Smith is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Sociology and founding director of the Center for Study of Religion and Society at the University of Notre Dame. I will say right up front that I love his books. I think he's a terrific writer. Moral Believing Animals is an earlier book that came out in 2003. And by coincidence, I have been quoting some of his book in something I've been working on for 5 years, which brings us to his new book, which he's been working on for 5 years. And he's the author of Why Religion Went Obsolete, The Demise of Traditional Faith in America. And not only does that book have a lot of his writing in it, but it's a detailed study of the subject, including graphs and charts and questions to people that they have polled and talked with. So it's an amazing book, and we're going to dig into that. We're going to make it a book club offering in September in my book club. It has to be read. And now we're live. Please subscribe right now on YouTube and in conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack commentary page, It Has to Be Said, at frankschaeffersubstack.com. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is kind of an odd question just to lead into it. But what I want to do is read a bit from the book. I have taken parts out of this, not in the order in which they appear. I think this little passage is from page 372. Forecasting the future is not the sociologist's job description. History is full of surprises, but nothing on the sociological radar screen suggests anything but the continued obsolescence of traditional religion in the coming years, along with the growing influence of re-enchanted spirituality and O-culture. I guess that's how you would say it, the occult. Religion will not go extinct, but it will likely remain a marginalized species in an unfavorable American sociological ecosystem. And then in another place, you say the overall intention here is not to provide a comprehensive depiction of the zeitgeist for its own sake, but to make clearer how the cultural atmosphere of the era undid religion. And then the only note I want to add before we get into it is a personal one. Of course, I did a word search when I got my Kindle version right away for Schaeffer and read with great interest somewhere in the middle of the book your description of the influence my dad had with his film and book series, How Should We Then Live Whatever Happened to the Human Race, with Dr. C. Everett Koop. I thought it was a very fair and accurate presentation. You know, you always kind of judge a conversation or a book when someone talks about your own home turf. You figure if they can get that right, they can get everything right. And you certainly nailed that. I thought it was terrifically accurate. And so I come to the book very favorable to it. It's a lot of your observations dovetail with things that I've observed, not by studying them the way you have, but simply having been in the story, because a lot of the people you talk about, I knew personally, whether it's Jerry Falwell or Pat Robertson. I was on the 700 Club actually 7 times, and Jerry Falwell lent me his jet once when I was on a speaking tour for my dad when he had cancer. So the world you described as part of the undoing of religion in America and the loss of favor it has suffered with people who have left it, such as myself, to use a personal example, ties into some of my own family history. So I guess the first question I have for you relates to the book itself, where you say, imagine getting together a room full of experts on American religion and culture and asking them to come up with a plan to wreck American traditional religion as effectively as possible. What would they could recommend? One of the best ideas they could propose would be to set up a steady stream of prominent religious leaders being caught engaging in a variety of sexual and financial scandals that would be publicized widely by the media. And that's not where your book starts, but I guess I'll dive in there because that's the kind of big time God cash religion business I come from. Although my father was not one of those people caught in a scandal, we were working with people who, in one way or another, all of whom who got famous and or rich or were involved in scandals and basically became the kind of characters you describe in your book that undid so much of the allure of religion in America. And I guess the big difference between you and me is, you're coming from this, I think, as I don't want to put words in your mouth, but from the point of view of a Roman Catholic, and I come from an evangelical background. But other than that, um, your book resonated so much with me because it reflects so much of my own personal family history. It's kind of crazy. I'm 73 in August, and I've lived through the era you're describing where it all came apart. The optimism in the 1980s in the Reagan era that, we're on the map and this is all going to happen again, all the way to the present era. So that's kind of a long, crazy introduction. And I normally wouldn't do that much talking at the beginning of an interview because you're the one that needs to do the talking here. But I just thought I'd put myself in your story a little bit and locate where I'm at in your book. I don't read this abstractly. I read this very personally.
Yeah. Yeah, well, historians have taught me that one of the marks of a successful book is if people who are part of what you're writing about can read it and say, "Yeah, I recognize that. That resonates with what my experience was." So I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. And actually, just for the record, I converted to Roman Catholicism, but I grew up moderate Presbyterian evangelical
Okay.
in the Westminster Seminary East circles, and in the church I grew up in, there was book tables in the back, and half of them displayed were your father's books. I think he actually came and spoke in an evening service one time, and I read
Mm.
numerous of his philosophical oriented works
Yeah.
in the 70s and early 80s. So yeah, it's also part of my history also is overlaps with all of this stuff as well. So
Yeah, and I can feel that in the book, but part of the genius of the way you write, and I felt it very much in Moral Believing Animals. And by the way, I know when people refer to nonfiction things I've written, my fiction's fine because it lasts forever, if you want to put it that way. I wouldn't change things, but it's like, oh crap, I wrote that, 25 years ago or something. And since then, I would put it very differently, if not having altogether changed my mind. So I don't want to belabor Moral Believing Animals, but I want to tell you that that book reflected so much of what I have come to conclude in my own life and my own journey, winding up, I guess, as describe myself as an atheist who prays. I'm a sort of a French style bad atheist in the sense that, I'm officially atheist, but unofficially still very much my mother's son, if that makes any sense to you.
yeah, yeah.
But I really love that book. And I read it again before I read this new one to kind of prep myself for what you would come up with on the new book. Let me ask you a question that's sort of personal. One of the things that I love about your book is that I can read both books and not run into a declaration of faith where you start out by saying who you are. And it's not that you're ducking the issue, but you do the thing that journalists say they're doing, which is kind of objectively come to a subject. And in Moral Believing Animals, one of the things I love most about the book is those little sections where you sort of you write how people think in various areas. Okay, this is how, and I don't think I'm using an accurate example, but an agnostic or a feminist or whoever would come to this subject. And I found those incredibly fair and free of irony. And you've done it again in this other book. So the first thing I want to ask you is a personal thing. How is it that you've approached what is by nature a controversial, fraught subject with such impartial fairness? And I know, I read other academic books by people who try to do that, but they bleed into the text, and you don't. It's as if somehow you have a respect for the people you're talking about that I don't see in most books.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, well, first of all, the obvious point is I am not a polemicist. I'm not a theologian. I'm not an ethicist. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a sociologist. And
Yeah.
there are plenty of sociologists who are trying to remake the world in the image of their ideology. My view of sociology is its gift to the world, if it has one, is to help the world to see, or people in society to see, what is going on around them at the big picture level,
Yeah.
so that they can sort it through, deliberate, have conversations, et cetera, et cetera. It's not
Mm.
my job to tell people, what they should believe. It's my job is to represent as fairly and accurately and sort of analytically, insightfully as I possibly can to help other people understand
Mm.
what's going on around them. As individuals, we're all sort of live in our immediate lives. It's hard to
Mm.
get up above that and see anything at a big picture level. So I think that's what I'm trying to do is I help people see from a big picture level. And if I bias that or distort that or let my own agenda get in to that's really obstructing my central goal. So
Yeah.
at the same time, it's clearly, I mean, we don't just remove ourselves from our work. My background, my commitments, my interests all show up,
Yeah.
but I have to work to not let them sort of take over. The
Yeah.
other thing is, in the 90s, I have mixed feelings about postmodernism, but in the 90s, it became all the rage to sort of like everything you were doing was really sort of a self-expression of one's own, like you couldn't really talk without first letting everybody know who you are and where you're coming from. There's virtue in that, but I really want the knowledge to come from it to be focused on the world beyond me and not on
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. Yeah, and that leads me to something that I sort of pulled out of context. And by the way, this is not a trap, so relax. I'm totally on your side. But I couldn't resist doing this to you. In our interviews, you say we asked these questions, and then I'm gonna put my note in. And now I want to ask you them too. I think this is pretty late in the book, page 300 and something. Is there anything in your life that makes you feel connected to something bigger than just your individual life, like a larger tradition, heritage, movement, or cause? And the next
Mm.
question is, when you hear the word historical tradition, in quotes, what does it make you think of? What images come to mind? And the next question is, would you say there are any external institutions or traditions that you think should have authority for living life that should be trusted and relied on to know how to live? So you can answer all or none of these, but let's start with the first one again. Is there anything in your life that makes you feel connected to something bigger than just your individual life, like a larger tradition, heritage, movement, or cause? And by the way, I'm perfectly happy to have you turn that around and ask me the same thing. I think that would be really interesting to try to figure that out. So
Yeah.
I don't, but I read that and I thought, okay, I'm about two-thirds of the way through the book or more. And I'm very interested in what people told him. But what I'm most interested
Mm.
in this context is what Christian Smith would tell me, because I've just invested hours and hours and hours and hours reading about other people's views. And I want to take a minute here and ask you how you'd answer those questions.
Yeah, so good question. Normally I punt on this one and say, well, I'm just a sociologist, et cetera. But in this
Yeah.
context, I'll say, my parents became Christians when I was 1 years old. And
Mm.
so I grew up in that context. It's been a long, winding, strange journey.
Mm.
But once that's imprinted upon you for so many decades, as you said, you're the son of your mother, so you can't just sort of become another person. But
Right.
life also has a way of being more complicated and
Mm.
difficult and challenging.
Mm.
And as an academic, maybe even intellectual, there's lots to wrestle with. So that makes everything for me more challenging and difficult to sort out how it
Mm.
all fits together and so on. So I'm committed to, I still have the underlying, well, I would say I'm a metaphysical realist. Like, I think there is a reality out there beyond our heads.
Mm.
I'm actually a critical realist, which is a particular kind of realist in terms of epistemology and so on. So that means I'm still interested in understanding what's true about reality,
Mm.
um, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I also have a profound appreciation, maybe from having been raised a Calvinist, I don't know. I also have a profound appreciation for the extreme limits of our neurological capacities to understand and perceive anything. So
Yeah.
there's also a lot of like, what do we know?
Yeah.
In terms of a virtue, you would call it humility rather than skepticism. But Yeah, so there's a lot running on there. I would say I've actually spent in addition to working on this book, I've spent the last 6 years learning tons about the environment and global warming. It's
Mm,
a huge concern. It's pretty depressing, but that's something bigger, clearly bigger than myself
yeah.
that I'm interested in. At a personal level, I'm very interested in my kids. I have children, and I'm invested in them. So there's a lot going on. I like to work outside,
Mm.
gardening, restorative agriculture, etc. But as far as the big picture, um, yeah, I don't have it all figured out. Put it that way.
Well, honestly, this is going to sound very strange, but if that what you just said in answering those questions was written out and someone said, "Would you sign your name to this?" I would. In other words, you've expressed exactly who I am. And I wasn't predicting that. I wasn't
Mm,
fishing for that. But that's, where I'm at right now from a very different position. I'm not an academic, I'm a writer, but my experience of life basically has put me in the same frame of mind on all fronts, starting with regenerative farming, which my grandson is doing in upstate New York, managing 5 regenerative farms. That's what he studied in college. And then the 3 of my youngest grandchildren who live across the street, for whom I've been doing childcare for the last 16 years, as a conscious choice of this is more important than anything else I'm doing. So I'm setting aside time to do that. This is where I've cast my vote.
mm,
And of course, then that bleeds back into the way we look at our faith issues because in one weird way, this is going to sound crazy, but in a way, I think, my mother was right about everything. And at the same time, I'm not sure that any of the truth claims she would have made for what she believes that I would sign my name to.
mm,
But there's the answer of modernism certainly has not convinced me that anybody else has a better explanation. They have different explanations, but not better ones. Okay, enough of myself. Now let me get back to your book. That's your fault. See what your book does. It makes you think. American religion may have become obsolete, but most Americans have not become naturalistic secularists. Many have instead become re-entrenched,
re-enchanted.
re-enchanted through spirituality and what you call O-culture, which is kind of like the occult. Religion did not be, and I'm paraphrasing this together, religion did not become obsolete because secularity won the day. Religion lost out in good measure because alternatives that are actually more like religion than secularism emerged, cultural options that proved attractive to many post-boomers. And then in another, you say American evangelicalism's turn from its original mission of evangelization and intellectual influence and toward political power generated a defensive backlash from a broad array of Americans who otherwise had been willing to coexist and possibly even converse with conservative religion. And then that's actually in the section, I believe, where a couple minutes later you're into my dad and what he meant and what his work did. And the only thing I would add as a personal note is one thing you got totally right. That is, if you didn't put it this way, but you implied this, if you took the body of his work up to his last 3 books, How Should We Then Live, Whatever Happened to Human Race, and A Christian Manifesto, you would be hard placed to say whether he was of the left or the right. You would say he was a fundamentalist believing Christian, but he was writing about ecology, he was writing about
Mm,
music and art. And it's really only in the last 7 years of his life that you would place him on the right. And I bear some responsibility for that, although I think he bears more because he was the grown up in the room, because it was Dr. Sierra Coop who talked me into getting to him to make a whole series on abortion
mm.
following his first series. And that of course, cemented him as having presented evangelicals with one of their kind of linchpin litmus test markers. And your book actually implies this too, and says it very well. And that is what a lot of people don't realize about the evangelical movement is when we first went out there with abortion as the issue, we had to talk the editors of Christianity Today and all these other people, including
Hmm.
Billy Graham, into taking a stand. Well, Billy never did because he said he wouldn't do that.
Hmm.
So I don't think a lot of people in the media have understood that this was not a fait accompli, that evangelicals were not all, quote, pro-lifers, like, say,
Yeah.
I'd say the Roman Catholics were. I just want to throw that out for what it's worth.
Yeah, so when I discuss your parents, especially your dad, that's on a section on what I call evangelical mission drift. And
Yes,
I think it's fair to say that his body of work actually sort of embodies that. I didn't know him personally, but yeah, his early work was part of what I say was post-war neo-evangelicalism's mission, and then
sure.
it sort of transitioned over, and he had a huge influence.
Yeah.
Back to your first point there. Yeah, so here, my book basically argues that traditional religion has gone obsolete. It did in the 90s and early
Yeah.
2000s. However, we need my second major point of the book is we need a different frame to understand where things are and where that's going as
Yeah.
follows. Um, the standard way that almost everybody in this country thinks about these things is
Mm.
that religion and secularism are a binary. In this whole cultural sphere, there's
Yeah.
just a binary. There's religion, there's secularism. And it's like an American football game out
Sure.
on the field. For every 10 yards, one gains, it's 10 yards, the other loses.
Hmm.
Um, whether or not that was true in the past, what I want to say is that's a gross oversimplification of where we are now. There's been a whole nother section of the field that's basically been taken over by people that want to play a very different game.
Yeah.
It's what I call re-enchanted culture or a culture. A culture isn't strictly about the occult. The
Yeah.
etymological origin of the word occult is things hidden or things secret.
Sure.
And so a culture is the culture of things secret or hidden. So here we're talking about everything from neo-paganism to a lot of versions of spirituality to alternative healing, chakras, manifesting the laws of attraction. There's this whole sphere of activity and markets
Hmm.
and beliefs that just don't line up with traditional religion or secularism. It
Yeah.
shares some with both of them, but it doesn't. So there's really a third major player on the field. And part of the problem is um, when people look at a culture through the lens or the eyes of how they view traditional religion, it
Hmm.
becomes mostly invisible. It just looks
Yeah.
like, oh, that's just entertainment, or that's just people being stupid or silly. It's marginal. But if you take it seriously on its own terms, this whole re-enchanted cultural world, and develop the categories and the perceptions and frameworks of understanding on its own terms instead of viewing it through the lens of denominational religion, say,
Hmm.
you come to see it's really huge out there. It's all over media, it's all over entertainment. I mean, I have been to vampire balls and
Yeah.
vegan retreats and paranormal conventions. It's just out there but it's kind of hidden in plain sight.
Yeah.
And many people who live in their worlds, their church worlds or their whatever worlds,
Hmm.
they're not exposed to it. But the reality is, it's not adequate anymore to see things as just religion, secularism. There's this whole
No,
other.
and I love that point you made because it's certainly not what I would have predicted back in the 70s and 80s. I mean, what did I know? But you felt you were at war with secular humanism and it looked like they were winning, and you didn't foresee, we thought exactly in those binary terms. It was us or them. And as we lost influence, and this whole idea of we had to take our culture back from them, whoever they are.
Mhm.
So let me just reintroduce you. I'm talking to Christian Smith, who teaches at Notre Dame, and he's the author of wonderful books, including Moral Believing Animals, which is a classic. It's 120 pages that I think is just brilliant. And he's the author of a new book, came out in April, Why Religion Went Obsolete: The Demise of Traditional Faith in America. And one of the quotes from that book that I want to just read here is, part of religion's slide into obsolescence involved finding itself caught in complicated webs of no-win situations. When religion seriously accommodated pluralism, it became milk toast. When it proclaimed a distinctive message, it was narrow-minded. Granting that people could be good without God was self-degrading, but insisting that people need God if they are to be good was arrogant and hurtful. And then you go on and you talk more about this. And I think that's one of those passages that really um, tells the truth. I mean, that you sum up the dilemma, and that so many people are caught in or have been caught in. And one of the things I want you to talk about is that, but I also want you to segue into just the scope of the book, because of all the studies and all the little figures you furnish and the graphs and everything else. Talk for a minute about all the interviews you did. I wrote it down somewhere. Now I forget the number, but it was a lot. You talked to a lot of people, and then you had backing from either the Oxford University Press or the university or whomever. You had help in all this, and the acknowledgments. You're thanking a lot of people for helping you get this information. So it's not just a series of Christian Smith's opinions, it's a bunch of studies that I think are going to be quoted forever because no one else has done this work. So there's really two books in your book. There's your book
Mm.
of opinion. Here's what I think happened. And then there's sort of incontrovertible evidence of like, here are the interviews, the polls, the numbers, the statistics that bear it out. Um,
Yeah.
can you just do a bit more on that?
Yeah, so again, as a sociologist, I'm obliged to make arguments that I would say not opinions, but arguments that are and conclusions that are based on evidence that we can collect. So the empirical evidence this book is based on, we conducted a nationally representative survey with a lot of questions. We interviewed 209 post-boomer Americans in all over the country. I conducted sort of big data word searches of a huge corpus of public media to try to get at sort of changes in public discourse over decades. Um, we conducted another survey once we figured out the re-enchantment thing. We went back and did another survey on that. And we conducted a bunch of focus groups, got people in a room, and instead of asking them, what do you think of this or that, I
Mm-hmm.
just showed them about 35, I can't remember, maybe 35 images of traditional religion and alternative religion. And I instructed the focus groups, just tell me how you feel about it. Like, what is your first emotional, affective reaction to that? Because, you know, a lot of people, a lot of Americans will say, engagement with religion is really emotional. That's not to say it's just emotional, but
Sure.
people have gut level reactions, either positive or negative,
Yeah.
or emotional bondings to, or anger against. And it took a little while to train them to not give me an argument, but to just describe how they felt about those pictures. Yeah. So this is probably the most data intensive and multi-method book I've ever done.
Yes. Yeah.
It's focused on the macro cultural and historical level, so it really
Mm.
requires a lot of different kind of evidence to make the argument stick. But it was a huge amount of work. It was a lot of fun. I hope it convinces people. Yeah.
Well, it certainly will. I don't see any way it will not convince people. I wonder whether you have knowingly or unknowingly gored somebody's ox in the sense that you always wonder what reactions will be to a book, from more liberal or right wing people, which sort of brings up something just I just want to go to because it's interesting to talk about. This is not what your book is about, but it seems to me that you're talking about the obsolescence of religion, but at the same time you've got Ross Douthat and J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson, who have all recently converted to Catholicism. And then the kind of first thing they did when they came in as converts is talk about talk about Pope Francis, the last pope, in a disparaging way, in one way or another, lamenting his liberalism. So, with the kind of enthusiasm of converts, and believe me, I understand where they're coming from because I've done this myself. When for a while I turned into a sort of a Greek Orthodox proselytizer using my old evangelical model of now I found the real thing and I'm not there anymore. So I'm not criticizing them for something I haven't done, but I just wonder in the context of your book, this is not what your book is about, but how do you figure in these high profile right wing converts to Catholicism who are kind of keying off Catholicism and at the same time just seem to be coming from the heart of the right wing of the 1990s, if I could put it that way. I'm not fishing for anything. I literally don't get it. This is
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
I'm asking you what you think.
So I don't want to make everything going on in the world fit the story of my book, but
Right.
and I don't have explanations for those individuals. Here, my guesses would be something like there's something missing, profoundly missing in American evangelicalism. I mean,
Yes.
obviously, I think that, which is why I left. I had a mentor at Gordon College, Tom Howard,
Oh, well,
who
Tom was an
also,
old friend of mine, by the way.
yeah, yeah, I had him for an English class. It was one of the best I ever had, and
Yeah.
so he had an influence on me. And I think he pointed this out about evangelicalism, and so I think that especially intellectuals, smart people, thoughtful people, people who can feel like existentially in their bones, there's something off here.
Yeah.
Another way to put it is evangelicalism is a very modern religious movement, and if
Yes.
you want some roots that go deeper than just modernity,
Yeah.
you have to look elsewhere, whether it's a Greek Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, whatever. So. I'm not surprised that there are plenty of especially well-educated intellectual people that head in that direction
Yeah,
at the individual level. As far as the right-wing nature of it, I would say my own view, like people ask me, if religion is so obsolete, how do you explain Christian nationalism and all the power it has?
sure.
My own view, I could be wrong, but I think it's true, is that Christian nationalism is not an evidence to contradict the argument about obsolescence. It's actually a symptom of obsolescence,
I
namely,
agree. Yep.
it partly because its discourse reveals a kind of a desperation that didn't used to be there. Back in
Hmm.
the old days of the Christian right, as you know as well as anybody, the discourse was we need to elect godly people to positions of power so,
Yeah,
to sort of get Christians and other godly people in the government to have laws that reflect, God, our heritage and God's
yeah,
will. Well, that's been totally jettisoned now. We're willing to settle for one of the most ungodly people you could imagine in the White House. To me, that's just a desperation. Even storming the Capitol building, it shows a kind of a realization, even if people can't intellectualize it, that we're in trouble. Like we are not, the Christian right, I think, or Christian nationalism feels under profound threat.
yeah.
And a lot of it, I think, is made up for political reasons. But I do think there's an underlying realization of like, we do not have the status or the position that we've had in prior generations.
Yeah.
And that leads to this kind of reactionary right wing desperation. That's my interpretation of it.
Yeah, and while we're off the subject of the book, although this is all the subject of the book, but I mean in a specific sense, and I'm going to get back into this quotes. I just wondered if you had given any thought to Tom Holland, the Roman historian's book Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. It's a book that I've read with great interest. He doesn't come at it from the point of view of being a Christian himself, let alone a convert. He talks about a godmother he had who took him to Anglican services that he remembers with great fondness. But he began to put dots together. Rome was horrible, it was cruel. You approach towns through, myriad crucifixions on the road leading in to keep the slaves in their place. And how did we get from there to the place where the UN Declaration of Human Rights basically mirrors everything about Christ's teaching about how you teach people except the teaching of Christ? And
Hmm.
so his whole point is we're like goldfish swimming in a bowl. We're surrounded by this Christianized water. It's so omnipresent in everything we do, whether it's gay rights or women rights or whatever else, that no one has stopped to think, well, where did this come from? And I don't know whether you've given what he's saying some thought. I'm just curious because I have such respect for your own writing
Yeah,
on
I
this.
mean, I've given it a lot of thought. It's a complicated story, but I generally tend to buy that overall historical interpretation.
Yeah.
Many human cultures are anything but humanistic or believe in
Yes.
equality or not to mention rights. It requires a certain kind of, I don't like the word worldview anymore, but it requires a certain kind of understanding of reality to give rise to those things and to justify those things because empirical reality doesn't show that everybody's equal and it shows a huge amount of difference. So I do think that so the Christianity, Judaism have had a huge long-term impacts on Western culture that have led to some of these things. Uh, I guess I would say I have two thoughts about that. One is, and I'm stealing this from someone else, and maybe it's Charles Taylor or somebody else, but I wish I could remember who, but I read somebody who basically said Christendom it sort of instilled this stuff deeply in culture and consciousness, but was never itself able to bring it about in real social orders. So it required the failure of Christendom to live up to its own standards to spill over into more secular realms to actually institutionalize some of
Yeah.
these things like the UN rights and feminism, some of which is literally against Christianity, not the
Right.
UN, but it's actually becomes against the traditions it historically depends on for its own rationale, partly because of the failure of Christendom to live up to its own standards.
Yeah.
That's one really interesting piece of this. The other really open question is if the original cultural rationales and justification for believing in humanistic rights, equality, et cetera, et cetera. If they fall away over some generations,
Sure.
is it possible to sustain
Yeah.
these beliefs and these commitments? Because they're costly. It costs a lot. It asks a lot of people to treat others this way.
Yeah.
Or will it eventually revert back to barbarism,
Yeah,
basically?
and you sort of answer that question in the context of suddenly China taking advantage of things like Trump's tariffs and a general kind of decline of the Western fan base, if you can put it this way, that was always clear through NATO and so on. Of course, I can't predict the future, but what's going on in the world today doesn't bode well for another 100 years of Christian influence in the same kind of way that, you think of Voltaire and all the things he was writing and the other what my father would have called secular humanists forefathers. But of
Yeah.
course, their main critique of Christianity was to use Christian standards themselves to judge the church as hypocritical.
Yeah, which is legitimate, but if you burn down the thing that's given rise to what your commitments are, then what are you left with? Yeah. So in a
Yeah,
way, I hesitate to say this on digital recording, but in a way, we may look back and say the Christian right actually was correct in the sense of, big cultural changes will have
yeah,
consequences.
yeah.
And your father argued that
He
explicitly.
did, exactly. And basically, without Christian philosophical presuppositions, at a certain point, if you don't have a certain number of believers who actually are at the core of the movement, then the fruits of Christianity, as he would have put it, will go away and it'll
Yeah.
wither on the vine and you'll be in a new world. And of course, Tom Holland, I guess, is warning in some way in his writing, saying, if you got too far from the base that gives you what we take for granted in terms of women's rights and other things, this will happen. You write both early and mid-century American evangelicalism and post-war neo-evangelicalism conveyed a general spirit of confidence, openness, and optimism about the future. Insecurities lurk beneath the surface but did not dominate. And then you get into something about my dad. You say Francis Schaeffer's message, which helped reshape evangelicalism's central narrative and reset its agenda, brought those insecurities to the surface and nurtured them in unkinder directions. Evangelicals increasingly adopted the role of victim of cultural persecution by their newly discovered nemesis, secular humanism. They cast themselves as the last ditch hope to save America and Western civilization from a destructive adversary. So that's kind of what you write in terms of his influence. But the larger point is that now we're into the area of kind of conspiracism and paranoia that is so unhinged that if my father was sitting here talking with us now, he would not recognize this moment. And in other words, he would be shocked that this is where we have washed up with a figure like Donald Trump and the right wing represented by people like Tucker Carlson questioning, he never would have foreseen anybody questioning election results. He never would have
Mhm.
seen the storming of the Capitol by people, some of whom might have even read a book or two of his, some of those
Yeah.
pastors. So what do you think about the jump from the 90s to the present? When you throw names like J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson, these around in the context of the Francis Schaeffers who sort of got to open this door, um, there's an irony there, but also there's a series of surprises that I don't think people foresaw. There's so much in your book that no one would have foreseen.
Yeah, well, ideas have legs and they go places that the people who originally expressed them don't necessarily want them to go. I mean, your
Yeah,
father would have been absolutely committed to the idea there is a truth. He was committed to that. Now
yeah,
we have a civilization that's flirting with just jettisoning truth. In my mind, commitment to accountability. We may have difficulty knowing what is true, but a commitment to accountability to the truth is a presupposition of civilization.
yeah,
So yeah, things have turned around 180 degrees from where your father would have wanted to go with sort of like there's the truth, we can know it, etc., to where we are now, which is just lie 100 times a day just for
yeah.
political reasons.
Yeah,
Um,
one of the things you do, and I'll back off here, but tie it together with what you're saying, is the advent of what we talk about in terms of modern technology, because Dad's work was before this kind of circle
yeah.
of living
Mhm.
in a bubble. We were still all reading the New York Times, as it were. Nobody was just getting their own private messaging out through their phone. So you have a very lengthy section in your book that I think is brilliant, by the way, in analyzing the impact on religion of all that. And I just want to
Yeah.
throw that in.
Yeah, there's so many different kind of forces at work in religion's obsolescence, one of which is what I call the digital revolution. The people that invented the internet, aside from the Defense Department people, the people that originally envisioned it were kind of hippies. They thought it would lead to this democratic world of public discourse and so on. It's gone anywhere but that. So, yeah, the internet, in my view, like nothing in my view is all black or white, good or bad. But the internet has some good things about it, but it also has some really pernicious things, and one of which is this centrifugal force of it liquidates gatekeepers, it liquidates authority, people that know more than other people. Like
Yeah.
everybody's thrown back on themselves. Aside from even before you get to, all the misinformation and lies and that the algorithms, play on fear and paranoia and all that, just simply, there's just this information out there. You get 100,000 Google returns, and each individual needs to figure out for themselves what they're going to believe. That really leads, in my view, or at least affords a cultural breakdown. It pulls everything apart and spins it out in a million directions. So that, in combination with many other, I don't want to be simplistic about anything, many other forces, the rise of
Yeah.
neoliberal capitalism, globalization, so many other forces, I think, have created profound insecurity in people. There's
Mm.
also been growing socioeconomic inequality, where whole sectors of people that once earned a decent, stable living are now the precariat in the world. They're marginal. I
Yeah.
think that has given rise to lots of insecurity and anger, which I think has legitimate roots to it. It's been
Mhm.
politically misdirected in problematic ways. So instead of understanding, oh, this comes from my job being outsourced to a poor country, it's now immigrants are horrible people, etc.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's a lot of macro technological, economic, hijacked by politics forces at work here that help to make people more susceptible to paranoia, to
Mm.
demagogues, to all kinds of craziness in the world that we see today. Where it's going, it's
Well,
kind of
one
frightening.
thing you sort of speaking of where it's going, take on very well is you point out that when it comes to the typical black and white secularist view, for instance, of science, saying, well, science is in opposition to religion, that it was never that simple. And out of Christianity and out of religion,
Mm,
science actually did emerge. Um, what Tom Holland calls the sort of Goldilocks principle, it would have been
mm,
similar to what my dad would say, that believing in an orderly universe that can be explored. And of course, this is the foundation of modern Western science. But what's interesting to me, if you want to wax sort of biblical prophetic for a minute, is to see the way now that these discussions you and I are having back in the 70s and 80s seem very theoretical in the sense it was about epistemology and theology
mm,
and your view of the scripture, inerrancy, and all this. But all of a sudden, we're in a period now where there's a measles outbreak because there's a bunch of parents who took seriously the idea that vaccines are bad and
mhm,
they have absorbed false information, demonstrably, arguably, scientifically false. People who avoided COVID vaccines and so forth stormed the Capitol, all of this. So the thing is, if I'd, been put in a time capsule in the 80s and woke up now, one of the things that would surprise me is that somehow the ideas we were involved in, or that you describe in your book as we being involved in, have borne fruit that's the exact opposite of what, say, a Francis Schaeffer, a G.K. Chesterton, a C.S. Lewis, or others would have said were the fruits of Christianity,
mhm,
which
mhm,
was you believe in an orderly God, you can investigate his universe, science has a basis to it. This is the glory of Western democracy. We've produced, it's not an accident that Harvard started out as a seminary, all the sorts of things my father would say. Well, all of a sudden, I'm down with my dermatologist the other day. I had some surgery. He was doing a post dermatological check, and picture me sitting stark naked on the edge of the bed on the little white paper thing, and he's sitting there in his tweed jacket and tie and white jacket, and we got into a conversation which was like a New Yorker cartoon, where I asked him how he was, and what he started telling me is how his whole project that he's been working on for 6 years at Harvard Medical, for
mm,
dermatological skin cancer of the kind he's just saved my life by having cut out of my head,
mm.
the funding just got cut.
Yeah. Yeah.
in the, and what's the relationship of that to Francis Schaeffer and the religious right that used to claim that science was the glory of Western civilization and so forth and so on. And now, this sort of alternative universe.
Mhm.
I don't need to go on about it. You know what I'm talking about. But anyway, talk about surprises that were unintended and no one saw coming.
Yeah.
Like
So
all that.
yeah, I mean, conservatives have long said, and rightly so, ideas have consequences. The thing is, they may take time for them to incubate the consequences to happen
Yeah.
first. And second, the consequences are not always what, again, I'm repeating myself, what the original articulators of those ideas said. They can head in very different directions. So,
Yeah.
another sub story in my book is there's a lot of irony in all this. There's a lot of
Yes.
unanticipated consequences. People expect the result of what they do to be A, it turns out to be Z. For example, in the book, I talk about how the very common evangelical discourse of you need a personal relationship with Jesus or a personal
Yes.
relationship with God
Yeah.
ends up getting, from an evangelical perspective, hijacked by people in re-enchanted culture say, I don't need to go to church. I don't need to believe in the Bible's God. I have a personal relationship with my own God. So
Right.
evangelicalism was so successful in getting that message out, but now it's being used in a very unevangelical way. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And comes around to bite you. Um, And you can picture some Roman Catholic or Orthodox bishop standing on the sideline saying, "Well, I told you this would happen when there was no gatekeepers any longer. You made your bed, go lie on it." Um, but in any case, let me get to a section of your book I want to ask you about. You say much more could be said about the Christian right. For present purposes, however, what matters most for our question is the backlash. The rise of the Christian right was shocking to many politically moderate and liberal Americans to whom it seemed a regressive violation of the separation of church and state. Well, of course, you go into that in great depth all through the book, but that quote gives me an opportunity to say, well, can you sort of lay out what you say in the rest of the book about just that backlash aspect? And again, this is personal because I've been involved in both sides of that.
yeah, so the image I use to describe that is like an avalanche.
Yeah, it's a
So
good one. Yeah.
it's the people that were turned off by the Christian right initially. Uh, We're not super highly committed Christians. They were kind of like go to church sometimes, nominal Christians, etc. But when Falwell and Robertson, these guys started doing their thing, they were like, whoa, no way. If that's religion, I don't want to be part of it. It wasn't everybody. It was a particular sector of Americans that reacted against it. However, here's where the avalanche comes in. I mean, an avalanche, if the conditions are set right, a
Mm.
hugely destructive force, or beautiful, however you want to view it, a thing can happen in the world. All it takes is a little start at the top. A skier just sort of pounds their ski to the ground. It starts a little bit rolling, but avalanches pick up more and more once they get momentum and the gravity's pulling them down. They pick up more and more snow and trees in their way. So I think there were things like that with the reaction against the Christian right that I describe in the book that got things going. And then more and more people were like, yeah, we don't want to do this. Another was sort of people saying, I'm not religious on surveys. Up until
Yeah.
1991, only 6 or 7% of Americans, every survey said they were not religious. But starting then, it started to grow, and nothing succeeds like success. So the more people are around who say, I'm not religious, the easier it is for more people to say, well, I'm not religious either. So these
Mm.
things are kind of upward and downward spirals. They have momentum to them, and they have real consequences for formation of people's identities and
Yeah.
commitments.
Well, now there's a twist on that because it's I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And you have a whole
Yeah,
section on that,
yeah.
which is sort of the next step.
The next step is the massive growth of quote unquote spirituality, and that looks like this. We use that as a category in sociology. You can ask, are you spiritual or not? But
Yeah.
that includes a huge wide range of types of people. Everything from somebody who just means, oh, I have an lively internal life of subjectivity, to people who are very seriously into paganism or whatever alternative religion. What they mean is I'm just not traditionally religious, but
Yeah.
they're still religious in another way. So yeah, that again, that's part of the whole culture thing that I think has taken over. We tend to think of spirituality as just this one category, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to say it's part of a much larger field
Yeah.
of things going on.
And one thing I was thinking about in reading, and you use this as an example somewhat in that, is things like mobility, break up community. People long for community, so they want to have a spiritual community. But of course, with all the inconvenient bits left out. So you don't want
Yeah.
anybody judging you. You don't want to feel bad. The kind of meism is writ large over the new spirituality. It's all about me. And I wanted to make a parallel here, and I'm asking you whether you think this is a fair one. And you kind of allude to this in two or three places, and I marked them, but I don't want to waste time going through and find them, the quote. But essentially, this also has a lot to do with our era in which less people are getting married, less people commit to each other, less people are having children, because it's still all about me. And you've got to find that perfect person. Marriage isn't a work in progress, it's a capstone to your career. You've done these glorious things. It's still all about me, which of course leads directly to the divorce court, because anybody that's been in a long relationship like I have knows that if I had always followed my worst instincts in every argument and so forth, my wife would have long since left, or I would have left her. So the very lessons that life teaches me as a married person or as a father or grandfather is, more or less the same kind of critique of myself, that spirituality that does have some inconvenient bits that say, hey, you were wrong, admit it, say you're sorry, backtrack. How
Mm.
do you see these two things fitting together? The kind of things that the pronatalists are talking about, like Catherine Pakaluk and others who talk about the birth dearth, on one hand, or Elon Musk for that matter, although he's doing it in his neo-pagan kind of way with his many women and many children. But on the other hand, this kind of the declining demographic situation America finds itself in, with the number of children born, and all Western countries do, and other countries as well, combined with this kind of meism approach to spirituality, which the idea of sacrifice or heroism, that used to be part of both religion and family life as a key to how to make it all work, it just seems to have gone.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a huge question, and any decent answer to that would, of course, be extremely complicated.
Sure.
In my mind, just to oversimplify, in my mind, part of it is we're used to it, but in terms of relative to human experience, we live in a ridiculously prosperous society. Like the
Yeah.
material prosperity from fossil capitalism is just amazing, and people get used to that and expect it. And then we have, our economy is predicated on mass consumption and then throwing things out and then buying more stuff. So, and then we have an advertising industry that relentlessly tells everybody, you deserve whatever you want. If you have an impulse, you should act on it.
Yeah.
This is the life you deserve. Get whatever you want, even if you go into debt. Like it's,
That's all in the book, by the way, just for people who haven't read
yeah,
it yet.
yeah, it's constantly telling people, and everyone likes to think, oh, advertising doesn't affect me, but cumulatively, it tells a narrative that reshapes the culture.
Yeah.
And after a few generations, like for you and I, cell phones are like, wow, that's different, or the internet, or even email. People born into it. That's just the way things are. And so
Yeah.
people born into this kind of advertising world, shape narrative world, it's just, well, I guess, yeah, I'm a consumer that's here to have my desires satisfied. And if
Hmm.
something doesn't satisfy it, I shouldn't buy it. And then that starts to get transposed to other spheres of life, like religion. Well, people are a pain in the neck in my synagogue or my church, so I'm not going to do it. And
Hmm.
you end up with people like, I mean, again, I'm not trying to be prophetic here, but I think the situation we're in is a lot of post boomers, especially, have the orientation, I'm supposed to have my needs met without too much cost, without too much hassle. And ultimately, we're talking about visions of what is the purpose of a good life. What's ironic, though, is at the same time, post boomers are also, I think, objectively, and they also realize they're kind of screwed economically. Like the
Yeah.
American dream isn't going to happen for them. And so there's a massive downsizing in expectations of what many millennials think they're going to get out of life, sort of readjusting. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it's complicated.
One of the contexts you bring up, and you go through this in some depth really brilliantly, I think, is just quoting from your book, neoliberalism challenged traditional religion. was by cultivating a new cultural sensibility that is antithetical to most traditional religions. In 1,001 ways, neoliberal capitalism socializes people to value autonomous individualism, continual innovation, material prosperity, market exchange relations, consumer satisfaction, endless competition, globalized cosmopolitanism, and the monetizing. I thought that was a big deal, and marketizing, you say, of all aspects of life, which is kind of what you were just saying, but it's a great way to put it in the book. And of course, we can sit here talking about this as if it's somebody else, but that's the world we're living in too.
Yeah,
So
I mean it's the whole world that we're enveloped in. I think it's possible to resist it to some degree, but in the end, unless you're going to become Amish, and even they can't totally resist it.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, so one of the background points in all this is that I really want my book to make is almost all the forces that made religion obsolete were not trying to do so. They were
yeah,
from other
yeah,
spheres of life. It was unintended consequences, et cetera, et cetera. Though nobody that invented and promoted neoliberal capitalism and globalization thought, let's harm religion. But it did, in fact, have those consequences.
yeah,
The sub story behind that is to kind of counter the more conservative, especially religious people who say, we're persecuted, we're embattled, the secular humanists are out to kill us, et cetera, et cetera.
mhm,
That's not absolutely false. There's some truth in that. For the
sure,
new atheists play some part in this larger story, but for the most part, A, the larger factors that drove religion into obsolescence weren't even trying to. It just had that consequence.
mm,
And B, religious actors did more to damage religion than anti-religious actors. I mean, there's a whole
yeah.
chapter on how religion kind of really damaged itself terribly, not just through the scandals you mentioned early on, but in a whole bunch of other ways.
Yeah, and I think, you have things in your book like this here where you say religion in people's imaginations is about settling down family, community, commitment, belonging, history, eternity, tradition, roots, external authority, objective truth, discipline, sobriety, sexual self-control, ethical constancy, and service to others. The experience of emerging adulthood then is a major cultural mismatch with traditional religion. Almost nothing about emerging adulthood finds traditional religion appealing or relevant. So that's very much the context in
Yeah.
which we are now. And I think that's
Yeah.
a good summation of the problem. Again, I have failed to give the flavor of the scope of your book because I'm not showing the graphs and the studies and the interviews. I just have to assure readers that when you get into Christian Smith's book, you're going to find what I think is the most thoroughly documented presentation of anything I've read in a long time. I don't read physics books, but it has a very sort of sciencey, well-documented base to it. I would say that in terms of the books I've read that explain the situation we're in now, I hope this is also taught in history and not only sociology. I would think it would be a history textbook for this moment in time. I don't think you can really understand where we're at unless you read this book. I think you've got to read Why Religion Went Obsolete. And of course, the title is a declarative statement. You're saying it is obsolete.
Mm.
And you're saying even the resurgence of religion in a way proves some of its obsolescence in the sense that you also said, if you're storming the Capitol in the name of Christian nationalism, you're basically admitting game over.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are various things in the news of late, that maybe the number of not religious Americans has plateaued, or that some study will show that in some churches, young men are more likely to attend church than young women.
Yeah.
And maybe that's going on, but those are blips on a screen. That the larger direction of things is really obsolescence.
Yeah, and Ross Douthat, we mentioned, he wrote this book, Believe, and so forth, and it would come and go like spit on a hot griddle. This is not the age in which William F. Buckley starts National Review and changes the whole direction of the Republican Party. In other words, it just seems to me a lot of these little anecdotes you hear have the flavor of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yeah, and Douthat's book, which I bought, he's not saying empirically, here's where things are going. He's saying we should. You have good reasons to believe.
Yeah,
It may be true that we have good reasons to believe, but it's still obsolete because things operate at a macro-cultural level that are not just down to rational arguments. Part of what's going on there, I think, is that a lot of religious leaders are so desperate for some decent or happy news that if a little, study pops up somewhere, or a big study like Pew, I think Pew data are great. They're ready to latch onto anything that may be other than bad news. And then also journalists play a part in this because
sure.
they can't just say the same old headline for year after year. Like
Yeah, yeah,
anything that they're always looking for something different or innovative or surprising. And I think that feeds into, but the consequence of that can be just wishful thinking
yeah,
masquerading as things are going to turn around.
yeah. And I
We're going to
thought
have
your
a
book was,
revival.
yeah, and I thought your book was an incredible anecdote to, not anecdote, antidote to,
Antidote, yeah.
anecdote as well, but antidote to this kind of wishful thinking. I mean, I found it very sobering in reading it because, though I have, become what I call an atheist who prays or an atheist who believes in God or whatever nonsense definition I've got to try to describe my conflicted state of mind. Um, Nevertheless, I mourn the loss of religion because I've seen some of the good bets. It's not all right wing Christian nationalism. I'm grateful that I live in Western civilization. I don't mind saying it, and that includes all our past sins. I don't look at history as the story only of oppression and all the rest of it. That baseline is one that kept Europe free of fascism and all the other good things that we talk about. But I'm so interested the way you talk about Eisenhower's prayer in your book and what that meant.
Yeah, so this is one of the difficulties and ironies in all this, which is if people practice a good religion for a long time, it often has positive pro-social, as social scientists would say,
Sure,
pro-social consequences. And it does, like kids raised in churches tend to do better than kids not raised in churches.
sure.
It's complicated, but that's the truth. However, it's impossible, in my view, and I say this in the book, part of people's looking at religion as something we should do because it has functionally good consequences,
Yeah.
that's part of what it sets up for failure.
Yes.
Because people end up saying, well, I can be a good person without this. Why do I have to go to church to make good decisions?
Yeah.
And the idea that, well, we need to get Americans religious again so that we have a more functional society, that's not taking the religion seriously. The religion doesn't say you should believe us because we'll have a more functional society. It says,
Exactly.
Christianity says you should believe us because Jesus Christ rose from the dead. So
Yeah.
it's like a double hermeneutic. You need to actually really believe it to have any positive consequences. If you
And
just
certainly, I'd certainly phrase that as any positive consequences, but I'd phrase it a little differently, saying any lasting consequences.
yeah. And those can be lasting for some generations, but this goes back to our earlier discussion. How many generations, and does it start to fade?
But I'm going to ask you a very personal question, not of you, but of myself. I'm asking you a question, forgetting for a minute we're on a podcast. What does someone like myself do who totally understands what you just said and believes it's absolutely true? That you don't just have inertia does not carry the vehicle infinitely far when the engine has stopped, when the actual sincere belief stopped. So what do I do? Because I am glad I live in the West. I'm glad my granddaughters are being raised here rather than Saudi Arabia. I'm glad they're not in China. I appreciate what we've got. Even at the tail end of even as it diminishes, I appreciate it. Even in the era of Trump, I appreciate it. Whatever's left of it. I totally get what you're saying. So where does that leave somebody like me? Because what happens if Jesus didn't raise from the dead? And none of it is true, if you understand by it what I mean. But on the other hand, it's very useful, and yet only making it useful diminishes its impact to the point where it doesn't matter, because if you don't believe it, it's a very difficult circle.
Yeah.
And for me personally, forgetting this as a podcast for a minute, where does that leave somebody like me who longs for a regeneration of Western values in the best sense of the word and criticizes the constant trolling by the left and the liberal elite, because there is such a thing, of the religious right that led to a lot of the pushback and the anger, justifiably so, ignoring them and so on and so on and so forth, but also belittling. But at the same time, what happens if it isn't true?
Yeah.
Where does
I
this
would
lead? How
say,
do we find that? How do we find something that keeps these things going if we don't have any basis in theological
yeah.
truth to fall back on? And I don't know the answer to that. I'm asking you, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think first of all, I think it leaves you in a really difficult position, which is exactly what you're saying, and that there
Yeah,
isn't a clear answer. My own view is that if you get rid of sort of the metaphysics of Christianity, Judaism, etc., and if you're thrown back on kind of a metaphysical naturalism, I do think humans are and can be moral. I mean, in that sort of mind experiment, humans can have keen senses of fairness, of
yeah.
empathy for others, of what in the 18th century called, sentiments for others, etc. I do think it's possible to sustain a long-term moral order that is not just moral skepticism, chaos, anarchy. I just think that's
Mhm.
part of human existence. However, it's not going to rise, or you cannot come up with a justification that rises to the level of equality, human rights, rule of law, except maybe at the not a level of principle, just a matter of function. So I think maybe the moral expectations need to be downsized or made more realistic.
Mm,
Having said that, I would go back. I think another avenue is to go back and say, why is it that I believe these things? Do I believe in equality and
mm,
justice and rights
mm,
and
mm.
all because I think it's really, really true, or because I grew up in it and I enjoy it? It's like a nicer way to live, but it
Yeah.
may not be true at all. If you think, no, it's really, really true, people should be treated this way, then that kind of raises the deeper question of on what grounds? I mean, we're
Mm,
going in circles here, but it could be the fact, in other words, that if you really believe it's true, you're appealing to some deeper sensibility or intuition or commitment, actually, to something that, in other words, let that
mm,
interrogate. Maybe there's something even at a deeper level than your skepticism and doubt and distance that might cause you to say, I need to pursue further
mm.
if I'm not willing to just give up on this stuff or just say it's my preference. Why is it that I'm committed to that? Is it just a historical accident? I happen to be,
Mm.
born mid 20th century America, or is there something more to it than that? I think that provides at least some ledge to begin to get some leverage to work off of to think about maybe there is something bigger true than just it's all culturally relative.
Yeah, I
Maybe
mean,
there really is a reason behind why the West has, in something better literally than Saudi
yeah.
Arabia.
Yeah, my wife puts it sort of differently. Jeannie, who I've been with for 55 years, said, I asked her the other day, well, what do you believe? Sort of a snapshot. And she was saying, well, I hope there is a God. And I said, well, why? And she says, because I would like to think that somewhere someone can manage.
It's not totally, out of control. Well, I think
Yeah,
that,
but I have another idea I just want to run by you briefly, and then we'll wrap this up. And that is that I find in reading a little bit about hunter-gatherers and others, one way I would put it, and I'm not saying this is what I completely believe, but the one reason Jesus's words resonated is they fitted in with this very well with this idea that it was never about the survival of the fittest, but always about the survival of the friendliest, cooperation.
mm,
And the only
mhm.
reason we're here is because hunter-gatherers, before there was even writing, let alone agriculture, let alone religion, had to treat each other in a certain way or die.
Yeah. No, there's definitely
And
some.
that Jesus's words are true in the sense they resonate with the truth of the entire evolutionary project, and that by straying away from that basic level of kindness and reciprocity that say Donald Trump is doing today, we're not just denying the teachings of Jesus, because the teachings of Jesus affirm what everybody knew already, or we wouldn't be here.
Yeah, there's definitely something to that. And the view of evolution that it's just nature red in tooth and claw, that's everybody out for themselves is only half of the story. There definitely is
Right.
the cooperation story and so on. I personally am not persuaded that gives rise to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah, I agree.
Um, There is, I don't know if you've read much about the axial age. In human sort of cultural evolution, all over
Yeah.
the world, there were people like Jesus and others who were saying, earlier than Jesus even, the Old Testament prophets who were saying, individuals matter. There are higher laws, et cetera, which really helped to propel sort of human
Mm,
morality and social order to a whole nother level.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think the question is, what kind of metaphysical background do you need, or sort of foundation? I don't like that metaphor, but what sort of metaphysical framework do you need to justify this over generations?
mm,
And you may buy the more friendlier evolutionary theory, but I think there are limits to it. And trying to explain to grandchildren, here's why you should be
right.
kind to somebody who's not going to repay you ever.
Yeah.
In the end, maybe we're being intellectuals. I don't know. People don't need it, but to me, it seems like it requires justification multi-generationally to explain to new
Yes.
generations why you should expend yourself in costly ways for the
Yeah.
well-being of others.
Yeah, and I love what you're saying about the idea that, if you go in this circle and say, well, let's enjoy the attributes of Christianity and Western civilization or Christendom, as Tom Holland would call it, the sacral aspect of our history, and at the same time we don't believe any of it's true. There's a kind of a hollowness to that leaves me very depressed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And eventually it collapsed. I mean, I think eventually it collapses, especially under the
I think
weight of
so.
all the power that technology and fossil fuels have given us. And
Yeah.
given that there are minorities of people that don't care about others and just want power and control, it really can destroy things pretty quickly.
Yeah, so right now, and then I'll sign off on this, but just to satisfy whatever curiosity you have, I would describe myself as the loyal opposition.
Opposition
Yeah,
to,
the loyal opposition to my own Christian past and my thing that I can't unscramble, and I'm pushing 73 now, so it's probably not going to happen. Getting using the old evangelical paradigm, there's true truth, you can find it, you can stand there. Um, it's not a question of giving up on that quest, but it's a question of realizing that also I was conditioned. I was my parents' child. I lived in a mission. I rebelled against it. There were terrible things about parts of it that I've written about in some of my memoirs. The kind of, I don't have to go into the litany of it, but the human failure of that, parents too busy to educate you because they're doing the Lord's work, all the usual litany, all the people. Basically, I read myself 100 times in your book of people's interviews of why they left. But at the end of the day, what really matters is not that. What really matters is my grandchildren's well-being and what I leave them, not how am I going to sort through my own mare's nest of conflicted emotion. But I've given up trying to say, well, I'll get past that conflicted emotion. And there's sort of a neutral ground where you can just discuss truth with a capital T. So, I feel very much stuck within a personal history, but at the same time, looking at the questions in a bigger framework, saying, yeah, and now what do I tell these grandchildren when they ask me why certain things are right and why they're wrong? And just saying, well, this is what hunter gatherers did doesn't seem like enough.
yeah. So I don't have any answers, obviously, although I can say, first of all, not patting you on the back, but it's good that there are still people that wrestle with these things instead of just tune into, the and streaming Netflix and watching pizza.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that either, but just doing so, it's good that you're still really wrestling with this stuff.
Yeah.
Also, from a Christian, confessional Christian point of view, it could be that you serve some useful purpose in God's hands for the chastising of the church. I mean, Karl Barth is a favorite. He's not Catholic, but he's a favorite. In
Sure.
fact, he called the Catholic Church the Antichrist. Another Swiss connection there, but
Yeah. Yeah.
Barth writes, Nietzsche was a great tool in the hand of God to chastise, the unfaithful West and the
Yeah.
unfaithful church. So who knows in the larger picture of all this? It doesn't mean you have to wrestle less or you may have suffered less, but life is one of the things I have always liked about Catholicism, or have liked as an adult about Catholicism, is its appreciation for mystery and not feeling like it has to have all the answers in a way that evangelicalism
Yes. Yes. I love
does.
that.
And so at some point, and probably the same thing with the orthodoxy, at some point you say, wow, I'm just this little pipsqueak of a human being. I try
Yeah.
my best, but the bigger picture is way beyond me, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah. And you run into it when Jeannie and I were in Rome a couple months ago, and down in the crypt where St. Agnes was killed as a 13-year-old little girl because she wouldn't marry a Roman centurion. And I have to tell you, all of that is very vivid to me. And it isn't, I don't stand there saying, did the miraculous things that are claimed about St. Agnes really happen? I'm just amazed by a history that holds up a little 12, 13-year-old girl who was killed and venerates her because she's not one of the powerful. She's not a tech bro. She
Yeah.
doesn't have $1 billion. As long as that tradition is still going, I'm going to be digging around the edges trying to find a way in, but not
Yeah.
one where I have to make a sort of an irrational leap that denies everything that I think I learned, which is bullshit. Because what do
Yeah.
I know? Life's too
Yeah.
short.
Yeah, so I'm not trying to convert you to Catholicism, but there are many things about it, partly because it's pre-modern. I think it gives us
Yeah,
a way to escape modernity somewhat,
yeah.
that gives us some helpful perspectives on our current situation.
Yeah, well, I'm rooting for Pope Leo, and I hope that JD Vance gets to my age and says, maybe I made a mistake in throwing my lot in with Donald Trump in the same time frame as I said I became a
Mm.
Catholic.
Hmm.
I don't see how that went together very well.
Yeah, yeah, me neither.
Okay, so I'm going to sign off, but I'm going to ask you a favor first. Please stay on when I sign off for a couple of minutes. Talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, so we can make sure to plug into your book correctly for the book club. And also, we always ask for ideas of other people we could interview we've never met and don't know about. And I'm sure you have one or two good suggestions for
Yeah,
us.
I do actually. Yeah.
And I would love to talk to them. And you've done the interview. And the other thing is, and I know this isn't very professional interviewee stuff, but I love your book. I've only read two of your many books, but I love the author, and I have a great fondness for you, and I very much
Oh,
appreciate it as
thank
one
you so
human to
much.
another. Yeah, I mean,
That's very lovely to hear. Thank you so much.
yeah.